Welcome to Coronavirus in Texas, a virtual event series from the Texas Tribune. I'm Abby Livingston, and I want to thank you all for tuning in. I'm here today with Congresswoman Veronica Escobar, and we'll be discussing the coronavirus, its impact on her home district, the federal response to the outbreak, and several other issues popping up in Texas politics until about 12:45 Central Time, 11:45 where she is in the Mountain Time Zone this afternoon. We will be answering questions submitted by our readers throughout our conversation, but before we get started, we want to thank our sponsors for supporting today's conversation: AT&T, Blue Cross and Blue Shield of Texas, Carlos Eduardo Cardenas, attorney and counselor at law, and Texas 2036. We would also like to thank PBS El Paso, the El Paso Times, and KTSM for their media support. Through donors and corporate sponsors underwrite our events, they play no role in determining the content. That was all me, panelists, or line of questioning. Finally, I'd like to introduce Congresswoman Veronica Escobar. She is currently in her first term representing Texas's 16th congressional district, based in El Paso, and she is one of the two first Latinas to ever represent the district and the state of Texas in Congress. Before she was elected to the U.S. House, Congresswoman Escobar served as El Paso County Judge as well as County Commissioner. She currently sits on the House Armed Services Committee and the Judiciary Committee and is a member of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. Congresswoman Escobar, thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Abby. It's so good to see you, and it's great to be able to have this conversation today. I've been looking forward to it.
As have we. So you were sworn in 18 months ago, and it feels sometimes like 18 years ago. In that time, you were sworn in amid a government shutdown. There was a horrific mass shooting in your district. There was a presidential impeachment. There was a trade deal directly affecting your district in El Paso. There has been a pandemic, and we are now in the midst of a major civil rights movement. What's it like to be in Congress right now, and this is all new to you?
Well, I will tell you, it's been incredible in the sense that, as you've mentioned, it's monumental historic event after monumental historic event, crisis after crisis. And, part of what's been really challenging has been having a White House that doesn't know how to deal with challenges, and the major challenges end up being turned into worse crises by the president. But I've been so fortunate, Abby, to work with an incredible group of colleagues, really wonderful folks who have embraced me and our community and uplifted us, and have really wanted to work collaboratively and mentor me. And it's been an experience like nothing I've ever experienced before, that's for sure. But it also is a tremendous privilege to represent this community, which has been so resilient and has demonstrated so much goodwill and beauty in the face of crisis after crisis.
And so we'll just jump right into the new coronavirus pandemic. And my first question actually comes from our DC fellow who is actually working in your area and is a constituent because of the pandemic, Valeria Olivares. And her question is, how are the pandemic and the resulting travel restrictions blocking travelers from Mexico affecting the border community of El Paso County?
It's having a tremendous impact, and this is where, again, I feel like we desperately need good, effective leadership from the White House. We live in a very important economic corridor. We live on the U.S.-Mexico border, those of us in El Paso, Texas, and despite the president's best efforts, it still is a relatively fluid border in the sense that, we have trade, there are maquiladoras, there is still essential travel that, goes back and forth. We have folks who live and work either in Ciudad Juarez and, live and work in El Paso, et cetera, who have to go back and forth. From the beginning of the pandemic, there really should have been outreach by the president of the United States to the president of Mexico to say, let's deal with this one region together, this border region, and let's come up with uniform standards. Let us help you. Let's help each other. so that we keep the communities on each side of the border safe. Instead, early on, as I was talking to Mexican officials about maquiladoras and whether they were engaging in testing and tracing so that we could all feel secure about our safety on both sides of the border, one of the first things I heard early on from Mexican officials was, well, the U.S. told us what they think should be essential businesses, never consulted with us, never worked with us. All of that really is very troublesome. It should also be happening at the state level from governor to governor. Based on everyone that we've spoken to in Mexico, that's not happening. So my office is convening a meeting with border members of Congress so that we can strategize for a plan on how to make sure that on both sides of the border, we have really great communication, but we're helping each other, that there's testing and tracing happening on both sides in a robust way. We know, Abby, that Latinos are disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. And so that makes us especially vulnerable. We don't want it to have even more of an adverse impact on our population and our economy, but it's going to take a lot of proactive work that's not coming from other levels of government, unfortunately.
And you talked about testing. One of our readers, Frank, wrote in, and I'm going to elaborate on his question, but he wrote, with the spike in coronavirus here in Texas, why not increase testing? And I'll tack on to that. How do you react to the president saying over the weekend in Tulsa that he instructed his staff to, quote, slow the testing down, please, quote, in order to avoid bad statistics?
Yeah, that was a really startling and horrifying statement. In fact, I've spoken with my team, and if no one yet has led the call for an investigation into that, we are going to do that. That statement has to be investigated. We've got to learn what, if anything, the president has done to slow down testing. We know that he has not created a national testing strategy or standard, even though we've written it into law. In the CARES Act, we called on the president and provided the resources necessary for robust testing and tracing, but we called on the White House to develop a national testing and tracing strategy. In the HEROES Act, we provide an additional, we actually double the amount of money. So it was at $1.5 billion in the CARES Act, another $1.5 billion in the HEROES Act, for a total of $3 billion for this. And we direct the CDC to do it. In the absence of that national strategy, that really it is the administration's obligation to create through the CDC, through the agencies made to, or there to protect us. Governors are having to do it. And so it's been governor by governor's decision on how to utilize the resources that we've provided from Congress. I don't think that we've had very robust testing and tracing in Texas. I don't think we had it on the front end when we needed it. When everything was shut down for that period in Texas, there should have been robust testing and tracing of all of our essential frontline workers, including grocery store workers, truck drivers, et cetera. A proactive approach is what we need in order to build up consumer confidence, in order to build up security and safety in communities. But we in Congress have provided the resources. There's not been that national strategy by the White House, so it's been up to individual governors.
How are the hospitals doing in El Paso? Are they holding up?
They are so far, and I think everybody is really concerned. I have regular calls with the healthcare sector, and we've not been doing well in El Paso in terms of flattening the curve. We are now up to, I think, 120 deaths. And it's concerning. I mean, that we are so far okay, but I know everybody is keeping a close watch.
And so Cindy, one of our other readers, asked, will there be a vaccine to try to eliminate the virus? And if so, will it be mandatory? And I realize you may not know the answers to that, but I'm just curious what you're hearing as a member of Congress.
I'm hearing really a lot of similar information that you're hearing, that it's kind of anybody's guess at this point, that the projections are maybe it's a year out, could be longer, could be a year and a half. It's not going to happen under the president's, the timeline that he stated. I know that there's a lot of folks working on it. What we should be doing additionally, Abby, is collaborating with allies and other countries. We have this shared crisis. We need to come up with a shared solution and use our resources together to try to achieve that vaccine as quickly as possible. But I don't have any inside info on a projected date.
So the question I have, because I'm in Washington and I have not been to Texas since the primary, and when I talk to folks in the state, what I hear almost all the time in the last month is nobody's wearing a mask. Are folks wearing masks in El Paso?
We are. I go to the grocery store, and when I go, I wear my cat mask. And so I've worn my mask. We have to now. Actually, as of today, it's finally mandatory. It took a little too long to get us to this point, but it's finally mandatory that you have to wear your mask, and that businesses will be held accountable if you don't wear your mask. We've had 2 bars that have been shut down in El Paso by the TABC because the bars weren't enforcing CDC guidelines. But the approach that's happening in our country really up until today has been punt to, the White House punting to the governors, and some governors punting to the local policymakers, the municipal and county governments. And in some cases, some folks punting to individuals, basically saying, you're on your own. Thankfully, we finally today, late June, finally have masks that are mandated. And yes, like I've seen a lot of people wearing masks. I also have seen people not wearing masks.
And so what is your response? How do you feel about the leadership in the state on this? And just broadly speaking, Governor Abbott, do you feel like the state is coming through this because he's got to balance the economy and the pandemic? Like, what is your view from El Paso?
I think his leadership has been a total failure, to be honest with you. I think there should have been a plan from the beginning for robust testing and tracing before the state was reopened. That you have to deal with the health crisis before you can build the confidence necessary to address the economic crisis. So, I'm in contact with restaurant owners, with small business owners constantly. I have heard from restaurant owners who say people don't feel comfortable yet. Some days they'll be full, but they're still not operating at the same level, obviously, that they were pre-COVID. Everybody wants the economy back on track. Everybody wants things to get back to normal, but you've got to create the confidence that you will be safe and secure, and that confidence will help drive an economic recovery. In Congress, we have done everything possible to help the states and the local governments during the times of economic duress, because we've wanted to give states the time to build up that robust testing and tracing strategy. In the HEROES Act, which is sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk, there is significant support for state and local governments because we know that they are suffering from revenue loss. But people aren't going to feel, not everyone is going to feel comfortable going out and helping rebuild the economy until we address that health crisis on the front end. And I will say one more thing, Abby, vulnerable communities, the response to addressing the needs by vulnerable communities was far too slow. That should have been a strategy on the front end as well, with prisons, with nursing homes, and with minority communities. We started to see some of that recently, the approach of having a specific strategy for testing nursing homes and for testing at prisons. But many of us have been sounding the alarm based on what Dr. Fauci has shared with us, which is that Latino and African American communities are as at risk and as vulnerable as nursing homes. That means you've got to test as much in minority communities as you test in nursing homes. That means you flood those communities with resources. I have seen a very anemic response from my perspective from our governor.
And how is the situation among detainees amid the virus? How is that?
We had I'm assuming you're talking about ICE detainees, or are you talking about state prisoners?
Oh, okay, ICE detainees. I apologize.
Yeah. So we saw early on, Abby, many of us in Congress called on the Department of Homeland Security also to think through a comprehensive strategy. We offered suggestions and ideas. One of those demands really was release nonviolent offenders that you have in ICE custody who have sponsors so that they can self-isolate with their sponsors. And so you're not creating a petri dish in your ICE facilities, which obviously puts the migrants at risk and asylum seekers at risk, but it also puts at risk our employees. Whether those employees be the guards or the administrative personnel or the lawyers or the judges, all of those who have to continue to engage with that population. DHS was very slow on that as a result. And not only were they slow, but they were transferring detainees from one facility to the next, essentially fueling the spread of COVID. So it's hard to know whether that was incompetence or whether that was deliberate, but it puts everybody at risk when there's that kind of thoughtless approach.
So to turn to the economy, you mentioned the HEROES Act, and that was if I remember correctly, a 100% Democratic passed bill. That there wasn't any Republican support on the House, and so it's effectively stuck until the Senate decides what they're going to do. What is your sense of the outlook of the next round of economic aid from the federal government on the pandemic?
I think the next round is going to be a lot tougher for there to be agreement on than the first few rounds. And here's why. We've heard from Republican senators that they don't see a reason for revisiting this, that that they feel that the need doesn't exist. I will tell you, I'm still seeing the long lines outside of the food bank. We're still getting calls daily from constituents who are in really dire situations. So I don't understand how they don't see what we're seeing. So I think there's that obstacle, getting them to see the human suffering that is occurring in their communities. But also they have a very narrow view. I've heard that there's talk about more PPP money, to help keep small businesses afloat. We know the disproportionate share of that, unfortunately, early on was not going to the people that we intended it to go to. Our bill, the HEROES bill, so much of that, Abby, was about refilling the coffers where there had already been bipartisan agreement before. So unemployment, as an example, money for local and state governments is another example. But there is this unwillingness, really, to think about this crisis comprehensively any longer. And in fact, from some of our Republican colleagues, it feels like they just don't want to talk about coronavirus at all. And if you don't talk about it, maybe that means that it goes away. We know we're not done with the first phase. I think we all need to be worried about the fall and what could happen when we have the possible second phase and intermingled with the flu and with everything that happens during flu season. So my hope is that they've said they'll consider something after the 4th of July holiday. My hope is that they do. My hope is that there's enough pressure on them so that they take comprehensive action the way we have.
And so, one of the things that Republicans have also been viscerally critical of Democrats about is the new rule change of vote by proxy, where individual members have been able to designate colleagues to vote in their place. And you did that recently. You
Mhm.
designated Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia, and she was very proud to do that. What is your response to the Republican criticism that this is just a complete change to how Congress is supposed to work? I think the word unconstitutional has been thrown around. I guess, one, what's your response? And two, what went through your mindset when you decided to vote by proxy?
So, number one, every major organization has a continuity of operations plan. When I was county judge at the county, it's called a COOP plan. We had to have it in place should there be an emergency where we want to keep people safe. I honestly, Abby, I don't understand the controversy. I feel like it's such a manufactured controversy. We want Congress to operate in the 21st century and do what every other organization across the country does with its continuity of operations. So I don't see the controversy. Where I do see controversy is where I have colleagues who have refused to wear masks in closed hearings. And, I'll give you an example. When we had our hearing on the Justice and Policing Act, we had to have it in the visitor center. I'm sure you've been in the visitor center. It's this huge cavernous room, and we couldn't even sit 6 feet apart. We were seated even further apart because so many of my Republican colleagues chose not to wear masks and really defiantly refused to wear masks. And so I think I'm hoping that with the new rules, where masks are mandated by the House physician, that we will see more compliance on that front, because we keep reading in the news about a new member of Congress who was exposed somehow. And what that does is it exposes everybody who comes into contact with them, and then they take that exposure home with them. Um, so I see no controversy with the proxy. It was put in place specifically for this. I used it once, and I was very proud that my compañera Sylvia Garcia had my proxy. To me, it's a continuity of operations deal, and as we are seeing some communities become hotspots again, I think those members should utilize their vote by proxy and stay and work, in their district, and not expose themselves to further contact and come back. For some of us, myself as an example, it's 4 flights. It's not a direct flight, so I fly from El Paso to Dallas or Houston, and then to DC, and then the same thing back home if I'm lucky to get limited flights that where there's only those 2 stops. And so it's everyone needs to judge for themselves and have the ability to judge for themselves what the risk is in that moment, what the risks are in their community. And I'm very proud that Congress finally has a continuity of operations plan.
I'm always intrigued with relationships in Congress. What made you choose Congresswoman Garcia?
Congresswoman Garcia and I have such a great long-time friendship. I met her when she was a county commissioner and I was a county commissioner way back in the old days. We served on the Conference of Urban Counties Policy Committee together, and she was the chairwoman. And I'll never forget going to my first meeting, and Sylvia is this fair-skinned blonde, and she came up and introduced herself to me and began speaking Spanish. And I was like, oh my God, I love her already. She had this ease about her. And so we've been longtime friends. I have 1000% trust in her. I have, great love and trust for my colleagues, but Sylvia and I have a special bond together.
So I want to turn to the response, and you touched on it earlier, to the death of George Floyd. And you're at the center of this because you serve on the House Judiciary Committee, which oversees the Justice Department. And so you're an especially good person to talk to about this. Where do you see, there have been 2 differing bills. The House Democrats, can you explain the House Democrats' proposal and then where you see it going, and if you think it has a shot at some sort of conference bill with Republicans who are trying to their bill is more centered around giving funding for better training and things like that.
Right. And you hit the nail right on the head, Abby. There are some very similar top lines between the Senate bill, Senator Scott's bill, and the House bill that we are going to take up on the floor this week. The main difference can be summed up this way. Their bill, they're choosing to try to incentivize change. And in some cases, actually, to be fair, to punish. So it's like a carrot and a stick approach. Like, if you don't do this, then you're not eligible for our funding, for federal funding. Whereas the House bill is much more proactive, and the way that we've described it is it's rules with teeth. My view is that we have a brand new civil rights movement that has awakened a generation of new leaders and activists who are done with seeing so much pain and tragedy unfold right in front of them. And I think they know that were it not for this, for their cell phones and their ability to film the occasions like the murder of George Floyd, which happened in full public view, that without that evidence, change would not come. And so we have the obligation to rise to this moment in American history, hear the cries from the people all across America, and provide them with the reform that is long overdue. I think if we don't rise to this moment, we really risk inflaming that anger and creating a deep-seated cynicism in a population that is looking to us for leadership and indeed demanding it.
So, going beyond police procedure in this context, there seems to be some sort of a critical mass of looking at race very differently by large sections of society compared to a month ago. Is there a role within the federal government to address other issues of race, whether it's economic, education? Is this anything you hear chatter about within Congress?
Absolutely. We've had so many conversations as a caucus about how this goes beyond policing, that this really, and it's not just been this, the new civil rights movement that we're seeing emerging from police brutality, but what we've seen basically exposed during the coronavirus, which is, all of these disparities. When you look at the numbers of African Americans dying and Latinos dying at far greater rates than white Americans, it goes, and Dr. Fauci has laid it out very clearly. It's essentially generations of not having access to health care, not having access to primary care, not having health insurance, et cetera. There's so much in this historic moment in America that is being laid bare before us, that our response has to be greater than just the policing bill. And we have had many conversations about that, about disparities in education and healthcare, the different economy that exists for the different groups of Americans. One of the things that I've brought up as well is, we've got to take a step back and look at the way that we plan for the future, and how can we do that, take this moment and really truly live up to it, so that the pain that we're seeing unfold, so that we're responding to it, listening to it, hearing it, and legislating from it.
So I'm going to turn to DACA. The United States Supreme Court ruled against the Trump administration last week, but it still remains the young people known as Dreamers still remain in some form of limbo. John Cornyn said on the Senate floor, the senior senator, that he'd work with anyone, Republican or Democrat. Given that Texas is the largest border state by population, delegation size, in that context of that statement, has there been any talk among Republicans and Democrats within the Texas delegation dealing with this at all?
But he's not reached out to me. I heard about his comment. As you know, Abby, we passed the DREAM Act last year. So he doesn't have to talk about it. He can take action on it. He can actually take the bill that we passed last year, the DREAM Act, and walk over to Mitch McConnell's office and say, let's have a debate. Let's move this. If we need to, let's go to conference committee to come up with a compromise. But I'm hopeful that he will rise to that occasion as well. And I mean, Abby, there is widespread support for Dreamers. It's not controversial. Even among Republicans in our country, there is overwhelming support. Polling demonstrates that there's overwhelming support for Dreamers. This isn't a tough one. The only reason why it's tough is because you have an administration intent on undermining DACA. We saw these awful tweets by members of the Trump administration, people like Ken Cuccinelli and Chad Wolf, who was even on Sunday programs, critical of the executive order. So we've taken action. If the senator would like to join us, we would love that. It's not hard.
So again, you being in the judiciary, which is a pretty prime assignment for a freshman, but it also means a lot of controversy falls on your lap. Over the weekend, we saw the dismissal of the U.S. attorney from the Southern District of New York, which is the jurisdiction that oversees most of President Trump's business enterprises. It's New York City. Jeffrey Berman was terminated. It was extremely controversial. Have you received any guidance on how the Judiciary Committee is going to handle this situation?
There's been a lot of conversation over the weekend, I can tell you that. And we're having a hearing this week on Wednesday, in fact, with whistleblowers from inside the Department of Justice. I'm going to defer to my chairman, to Chairman Nadler, to talk about the steps that will come after that hearing. But we are very, very interested in investigating this. We are deeply alarmed. I will tell you, I have felt ever since last year that Barr should be impeached. I think he is a dangerous person. I think he has completely undermined the important role of the Department of Justice. He's undermined its independence and its integrity. I am really looking forward to Wednesday's hearing as we hear from those whistleblowers. The damage that Barr has done to the Department of Justice is, I can't emphasize enough how dangerous he is and how dangerous the damage is. So we'll see. I'm going to defer to Chairman Nadler to talk about next steps, but I think our response can't be strong enough.
Is there
time? Can't be too strong, rather.
And there's been some chatter about impeaching him about this. I believe Nadler shot it down yesterday, but is there time to impeach someone at this point, so close to the election? It's not just a question of timing, unfortunately, Abby. It's also a question of political will. We saw what happened in the Senate. We saw that the president, despite overwhelming evidence, the Senate Republicans chose basically to continue enabling a corrupt administration. You've seen President Trump, in my view, I think that emboldened him. And I think that he knows that, as he told us long ago, he could shoot someone in the middle of Fifth Avenue and his enablers will continue to support him. And so it's both a question of timing, which, as you pointed out, we are like 150 days out from the election, and we still have a lot of business on our plate. But number two, it's also a question of whether the political will exists on the Senate side. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't and we can't investigate. And I know there's a commitment to that. What is the outlook for the summer? I know a new schedule has been put out, but how frequently do you think you and your colleagues will be in Washington having hearings and having votes versus locking down?
So I leave tomorrow for DC and will be there this week through the weekend, through the end of next week. We have the NDAA. I'm on the Armed Services Committee, and so we've got our big markup. We need to deliver the NDAA for timing purposes to the House.
And that's funding and then for the defense, correct?
Right. I'm sorry. The National Defense Authorization Act. Right. Absolutely. For the Department of Defense. And then the appropriations committees will be meeting those following 2 weeks. And I think there's probably going to be hybrid hearings for appropriators. You know, some folks will be in their offices or in their homes, and some folks will be in the room. There's going to be a lot of juggling of the rooms involved. You know, I'm still waiting to hear about HASC, about armed services. I'll be there, but how many people will they fit in the room? Are they going to want some of us Skyping in from our offices in order to, to limit the number of people in rooms? So all of that we're going to play by ear. Then the last 2 weeks, will be a lot of voting on the appropriations bills, on any supplemental bills that might be attached, et cetera. We've got a very, very busy summer. But thankfully we've got the continuity of operations in place where we can now juggle it using modern technology.
And so we want to turn now to my favorite topic, which is campaigns and politics. How do you see the lay of the land in Texas from the westernmost point going into November? Joe Biden's been right in the thick of it, polling with Trump. The DCCC, the House Democratic campaign arm, is targeting many districts. Your district's probably safe, but what's your sense? Where do you think things are? Are Democrats going to make any kind of gains in Texas in November?
I believe so, Abby, and it's going to be really hard. There are huge obstacles for all candidates. You can't just go knock on doors anymore and talk face to face with voters because it's not safe yet, and it may not be safe before November. So you have to use whatever tools you have at your disposal, mostly social media and texting and phone banking. The president has an incredible advantage because he has the biggest bully pulpit in the world, and he has the ability to convene every media outlet whenever he wants. I mean, we saw him riding that wave during the task force briefings, where he really wasn't talking about the health situation, but would go all over the place in terms of his comments, because he just was soaking up all of that free earned media that he has access to. Having said that, I do believe that this is going to be a critical year for our state. And you mentioned, I live in a blue district, a historically blue district. From my perspective, what I've been trying to do since 2018 is increase turnout significantly in Latino communities and Democratic communities. In 2018, I worked with border grassroots folks, with Democratic Party organizers in various border communities. We had a border bus tour that went through those border communities. Our bus was filled with enthusiastic, hardworking El Paso volunteers. We wanted to double turnout in counties in 2018 and send a very strong message during the midterms. And we met or exceeded our goals. We have very ambitious goals again this year in terms of increasing turnout. If we are going to turn Texas blue, I think Texas is purple right now, but if we're going to really turn Texas blue, we need to work harder than we've ever worked to pull in voters who have felt disenfranchised or disconnected. And so it's really, really important work. We have a lot at stake, especially communities like mine on the border. El Paso has been ground zero for the Trump administration's policies of cruelty and hate. And so we need to respond in kind. But the way that we respond is with our vote, is through the ballot box, and by removing people who have enabled this administration, empowered this administration to commit acts we never thought the American government would commit. And I'm excited about doing that, accomplishing that. It's going to take a lot of work, but we've got to work like never before.
So I would say it's fair to assume most people who have your job are extroverts. Is it fair to put you in that category?
I don't know. You be the judge.
You're probably an extrovert. I've known you several years. And that's my question is, what's it like to be a politician and have to be home most of the time?
It is tough. Although I will tell you the schedule is so rigorous, the literally hour by hour Zoom events or conference calls, it has been really incredible to utilize the technology, though, in ways that I never thought. And so I'll give you an example. At the beginning of the COVID-19 outbreak, at the beginning of the lockdown, I was able to have a town hall meeting with Doctors James Hildreth and Dr. Scott Gottlieb, two nationally renowned public health figures. You've seen both of them on cable news, Dr. Gottlieb most especially, who's really kind of been the leading voice on how to deal with COVID-19. But we were able to have a Zoom town hall meeting with them. And, normally my constituents wouldn't have access to that kind of expertise. Last week, we had a great town hall meeting with Karen Bass, the Congresswoman and chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, the caucus that drafted the Justice and Policing Act. She was able to answer questions from El Pasoans because we were doing this in a Zoom format. So while it's been hard to not be out there and meeting face to face with people, we've been utilizing every single hour of every day to talk with stakeholders or to deliver important information to the community. There's also, the days are filled with caucus calls, leadership calls, the judiciary hearings, markups, subcommittee meetings and hearings and markups for armed services. So it's just done through a computer screen instead of in person, but it's tough.
So this is my last question for you. I've been watching you since you came in. You've managed to bridge divides within the House Democratic Caucus. There are folks talking about you who have their eye on you for the future. You are already in House leadership representing the freshman class. Do you think that's a track you want to go on, or do you think maybe you might run for statewide office like your predecessor, Beto O'Rourke, in that seat? Can you give us a sense of your future?
I have no idea what the future holds. My focus is work as hard as you can, build as many relationships as possible because it benefits the district, it benefits the community. Always think strategically about how to elevate El Paso and move El Paso. Outside of that, I'm just going to keep doing my job.
Actually, that was a nice way to close it, but I have one more that's really important, and I just skipped over it in my notes by accident. How is El Paso doing after the Walmart shooting?
I'm glad you asked that question. I just last week had a really incredible conversation with our mental health providers who have been at the forefront of providing care for El Pasoans who have been in crisis. They described to me a situation where there is what is called compound trauma, that we have many El Pasoans that they've been caring for and providing care for who have just dealt with trauma after trauma after trauma, COVID obviously being one of them. Families who have already been suffering through a mental health crisis who then deal with a lost job or a sick family member, or who they themselves have had to suffer through the coronavirus illness. And so they're very concerned, and it made me want to redouble my efforts to get as much mental health financial support for these organizations so that they can continue to care for the community. The other thing that they shared with me is they still have to go out and find a lot of folks who aren't voluntarily coming forward to talk about their trauma. And El Paso, unfortunately, is not unique in that situation. Every community that suffers from mass violence suffers through that same trauma. But you know, we're going to keep working hard to make sure that we have the resources for a community that, as I mentioned at the top of our conversation, has demonstrated so much love and beauty and resilience in the face of the most significant challenges and crises. And so they deserve no less. Thank you for asking, Abby. I appreciate that.
Well, it's an important thing. And so thank you for your time. We have loved having you talk with us. And thank you to our viewers for tuning in. And thank you to everyone who supported this event. Finally, if you want to keep tabs on the latest coronavirus news in Texas, please subscribe to our evening newsletter for updates at trib.it/coronavirus. Have a wonderful day, Congresswoman, and to everyone else in Texas, take care.
Thank you, Abby. Bye, everyone.